I am Flavia Bellieni Zimmermann from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Professor Richard Whitman. Professor Richard Whitman is Director of the Global Europe Centre and Professor of Politics and International Relations at Kent University. And today we are going to be discussing Brexit and the future of the UK. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Professor Whitman, if you could please explain to us how the UK Brexit will affect the United Kingdom and the UK as a whole and the future of the European Union.
Well, the Brexit process itself is only really started, and that may seem a strange thing to say almost 3 years after the vote, but because the focus really has been on how you detach the UK from the EU, indeed whether it will detach, rather than really getting to grips with what the consequences of Brexit are. Both the consequences for the UK, but also crucially what the consequences are for the EU. Because for the EU, they've been able to focus on preserving their unity in the negotiations with the British government, because of course they want to have a negotiation that's in the best EU interest, rather than perhaps questions about how you manage or structure or come to terms with the loss of what is a part of the EU economy, but also of course a member state which has been influential in terms of setting some of the agenda for the European Union, and also absolutely crucially being a key payer into the European Union budget. What happens when all of those things are gone? We obviously have to wait and see that as the sort of EU impact of Brexit, which is still to come.
Thank you. And Professor Whitman, if you could just expand a little bit more and tell us how the Brexit in itself might impact the future of the EU.
Well, for the EU, I think there's already a bit of an uncertain future, even without the Brexit issue, because you have a whole series of unresolved issues. For example, how you govern the Eurozone, how you make the single currency work in terms of macroeconomic policy. There's also questions around migration policy and how you manage migration, and in particular illegal migration, into the European Union. But you've also got a group of countries which are now challenging some of the core European values, and in particular the functioning of democracy, the rule of law, and the sort of freedom of civil society. All of those are really profound challenges to the EU, which in many ways are overshadowed by the Brexit process, or the focus on the Brexit process, but are potentially even more profound challenges than Brexit. Saying that, of course, Brexit will have an impact because the UK has stood for a particular kind of Europe. It stood for a European Union which is more intergovernmental. It's had less of an enthusiasm for the deepening of integration. It's generally favoured the liberalisation of markets, and it's been very interested in the way that the European Union can have a role within international affairs, but a role which is more about boosting the European Union's vocation, really, I think, for influence and for multilateralism, rather than necessary for sort of safeguarding the European market and so on. So all of those changes will come because you lose that voice and you lose that capacity to try and seek the agenda or to sway the agenda in certain ways. So that it will be a change, but not a change that you feel overnight. I think it will be much more incremental. It will depend on the issue area, and it will also depend on what crises the EU handles, and not having Britain there as one of the voices which is trying perhaps to mediate or to mitigate in the way that it has done in the past.
Thank you very much, Professor Whitman. And if you could please explain to us, with Brexit coming through, how it might impact the situation in Northern Ireland?
Well, the Northern Ireland issue clearly is a major challenge because Northern Ireland, or the border on the island of Ireland, is the only land border the European Union has with or will have with the UK as a non-member state. But it's not just that as a border between a non-member state and a member state. It's also, of course, because the history of that border and the fact that the way of mitigating and managing the conflict in the north of Ireland is being done by blurring that border, by blurring the border in terms of an all-island economy, blurring the border in terms of people's behaviour, in terms of working and shopping and all the things that citizens do, moving across this immutable border. But it's also very totemic because the border, or the absence of the border and control of the border, and crucially the role of the police, the army and the security services on the border is something which has been dialed down since you've had the peace process. So all of those things really have been the indicators of a successful process of conflict management. If any of those or changes to those things start to creep back in, required by the UK and the Irish Republic being on different sides of a customs union, for example, or being on different sides when it comes to the need to have other kind of border controls as a consequence of the single market, that changes the cross-border dynamic and potentially impacts on the characteristics of the peace process that you've seen in place on the island of Ireland. So it potentially has significant consequences for the Irish Republic, for Northern Ireland in particular, but crucially the all-Ireland peace process.
Thank you very much. And regarding to a no-deal Brexit, Professor Whitman, how this would impact the UK and the EU?
Well, a no-deal Brexit is the idea that the UK leaves the European Union with no formal agreement in place that provides for all of the issues that currently govern the relationship between the UK and the EU, for example, travel or cross-border trade, and the condition that citizens find themselves in, whether they're UK or EU citizens living in one another's territory. If all of the rules and the law and so on disappear, which cover those arrangements, then you create huge uncertainty. And it's very, very difficult to predict what the impact would be in both the short term, the medium and the long term. Because of course in the short term, people may alter their behaviour, stop doing certain kinds of things, whether it's shipping goods to the UK or travelling to the UK or travelling across that border. But in the medium and the long term, it has an impact because it creates a relationship between two key trading partners, and for the UK its most important trading partner, which goes from being a highly structured and rule-governed relationship to one in which all of the rules go out of the window. And by the way, for third countries, if you're trading with the UK and trading with the UK because it's a part of the single market, then that arrangement disappears overnight as well. So it's not just the EU-UK relationship which is impacted, but it's also anybody who travels through the UK space or between the UK and the EU, whether for the purposes of tourism, for business, and so on and so on. They would all be affected by going from certainty to uncertainty.
Thank you very much. And in your opinion, Professor Whitman, do you think Brexit will take place at all? And if there is even the possibility of another referendum?
Well, I think the question of another referendum can't entirely be ruled out, but I think it's unlikely to happen before the current scheduled Brexit date. I can imagine a situation in which you may have a referendum on a future relationship, because that's still to be negotiated, and particularly if there are trade-offs where the public needs to be asked whether they're willing to make those trade-offs. But it's difficult to imagine a referendum in the short term because there's no majority in Parliament for a referendum. Whether Brexit happens at all, well, it's something which automatically happens under the terms of Article 50. So the only way to stop it not happening would either be to revoke Article 50 for the UK to take back its formal advice or notification that's leaving the EU. That looks very unlikely to happen. I think what's much more likely is that you see an extension of the negotiating process. So the formal departure date is pushed into the future. But really, for all intents and purposes on both sides, I think we've reached a point where there is an acceptance that the UK and the EU will separate. It's just a question on what terms and on what timescale.
Thank you very much. And wrapping up our interview, take into consideration that the Brexit deadline might be extended. If there is a deal, in which terms do you predict that they might come through? Which are the main issues that would make part of a Brexit deal today?
Well, the withdrawal agreement that's been negotiated between the EU and the UK is focused on all of the issues that are there as a consequence of that attachment that's existed between the UK and the EU, which creates an interconnectedness, whether it's societally, whether it's governmentally or public administration, and obviously crucially in terms of the economic interdependence between the two sides. That's one of the reasons why you need a deal, because you need to make sure that you don't suddenly fall off a cliff edge. But even if you identify what the legacy issues are, for example, to do with people, to do with business continuity, to do with legal certainty, and so on and so on, all those are going to need to be issues that will be settled, even if you don't have the agreement that you've got in place that the government's negotiated. So I think that the withdrawal agreement, as it's currently set, is the most likely structure for seeing the UK withdraw, because any other ways of negotiating or dealing with those issues are likely to be much more untidy, much more painful on both sides, and much more prolonged to separate. So if you don't get the deal through, if Parliament doesn't vote the deal through, then the issues don't go away. They just come back in a more complicated form, I think.
Thank you very much. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us. For more information, please visit our website www.internationalaffairs.org.au.